what brought you here, aside from loyalty to me, of things that you'd like to talk about and hear about from your associations of what those words mean and how they might fit together. Queering, religion, both of those are buzzwords, and then depending upon your background, you might have some energy around Catholic. I want to start by sharing an anecdote with you. When I began in 2017 to teach this class, Queering Religion, I had a student right away, as soon as I handed out the course syllabus, gasp. And I thought, oh no, here it comes. She said, I thought the title of this course was Querying Religion. And I was so excited to think about a class that would focus on the Quaker practice of querying. I'm Quaker and we query, and my mom and I were talking about how cool it is that we'll be querying religion at a Catholic university. And she said, I don't know anything about queer. I'm like, that's okay, and we are querying. I thought that would be a great title, actually, for the class, another iteration of it. But that moment I learned Quakers query. And Jews question and challenge and insist and demand on making a text or a story or a Jewish idea relevant and compelling, and wrestling with that text and with those ideas until it fits and it feels authentic. And that is something that sometimes I take for granted as a Jew, but when I'm teaching in a non-Jewish environment, I really come to appreciate how my spiritual inheritance provides me with an obligation to question authority. Abraham in the Torah early on, God tells him to do something and he's like, what? Are you kidding? How can I do this? It's not ethical, it's not just. And he challenges, in the story, challenges God. And in the story, the character God really appreciates Abraham taking him to task. And they compromise, they come to a compromise. And from that, I'm reminded that Jews wrestle with divine questions and ideals and circumstances. And whereas others might say, well, it's because it's tradition, or it's because this is the way it's written. I've been given a tradition that says, don't stop there. If it's a religion that's going to make sense and feel like it has integrity, it has to stand up to the questions, the hardest, most difficult questions that you would bring to it in order for it to be something to follow. So I want to thank, that's my first story, and the evening is made up of stories that give you some notes or field notes of what I've been learning while working in a Catholic environment. I wanted to begin by thanking Manny and Manny's for this idea of bringing professors to this community cultural center and space. I think it's a fabulous idea. And I think I might have been in the first 10 minutes of seeing it and getting the invitation, like, I want to be part of that. And I also want to name that Manny has been quite a rabbinic voice to me in the last year. I had a chance randomly to hear him talk at Congregation Emmanuel about his own health scare and how being in a medical emergency moment enabled him to sink into prayer and gratitude for every breath. And I heard that at a time that was particularly poignant for me, and it really resonated. So I wanted to thank Manny for being a teacher, and Angelina for being a student and now a teacher. an instructor. And I also wanted to acknowledge Aaron Hontapper, who's the director of the Swig Program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice at the University of San Francisco. And Aaron is a tall, white, Ashkenazi, Jewish, heteronormative, cisgender man. And he has made it his mission, recognizing the privileges of those identities, to direct the Jewish Studies and Social Justice program to lifting up four communities in particular that are often on the margins. And he focuses specifically on Jews of color, Jews with disabilities, Jews who have a different narrative on Israel-Palestine issues than the mainstream, and queer Jews. And everything we do in the Swig program of Jewish Studies and Social Justice lifts up the voices of those four communities. This is his book, Judaisms, and I cannot recommend, if you're interested in Judaism, a book more than this one. And believe me, I have a very big library of books, so the fact that I'm lifting up this particular book, and part of it is that he had the chutzpah to add an S to Judaism, teaching us, reminding us that there's not a monolithic Jewish community. If ever there was, I'm not sure there was, but there certainly isn't now. And that Judaisms are influenced by where people, their other identities and the intersection of their race and their sexual and gender identity and their nationality and their religious practice or not religious practice. And so when one says, well, I want to speak about Judaism, they're only narrowly talking about the Judaism that is from their lived experience. And that extends in my learning to coming to understanding about Christians and Catholics. There are Catholicisms and Christianities, and it could be said about, for sure, the Abrahamic traditions. There are Islams. And part of the joy of working in this Jesuit university is the commitment that Jesuits have to religious pluralism, to recognizing that there are multiple religious stories and narratives, and they're all to be told and shared and learned from. And yeah, so one of the field notes, this is the title of my talk, is Field Notes from a Rabbi. Among my field notes include that the Jesuits in particular have some tremendous values and put them into action in education. As a Jew, I didn't know anything about it till I got to USF, and that's field note number 2. It's amazing how little we know about each other. I mean, as Jews, we're just happy if Jews get a Jewish education. We're not spending our, precious time in religious school teaching Jews about Christianities. We want them to be literate about so many things having to do with Jewish ideas, and same with seminary. So I went to school for 6 years at the Hebrew Union College of the Jewish Institute of Religion, and I didn't have a single, I had one course requirement in my second year of school that introduced me to Christianity very loosely, and I had no classes that taught me or expected me to read and know anything about the Gospels or the New Testament. I had no idea, actually, until having been a rabbi for 20-some years, I had no idea that the Gospels include stories intended for Jewish audiences in the Common Era. And anyway, the idea that we know so very little about our neighbors and the dominant religious culture that we live in, I have been committed to deepening my understanding around New Testament, around Gospels, and around Christian values, specifically Jesuit values. One of the Jesuit values that works really nicely with queering religion is called cura personalis, care of the whole person, care of the whole person. And so the Jesuits and USF have been bold in supporting my queering ministry, my queering religion ministry. I think it's really funny, but just last week I learned that I have a budget line in the university budget called Queering Religion. So I think that's kind of cool. Included, or in spending, I bought a big banner. It's a vertical banner. It says Queering Religion. It has the emblem logo of the Catholic University, and it has the star from the Jewish Studies program. And I don't know, I have a feeling there aren't very many vertical banners saying queering religion at any of the other Jesuit universities around the country. So I'm going to pause there for a moment. I keep taking the cover off of this, but really I'm going to set it down. That's pretty awesome, Camille. I did bring this for people to potentially look through and get back to me. So, let me tell you a little bit about what queering religion does entail at USF. Well, from 2000 to 2015, I served as the spiritual leader just down the street at Congregation Sha'ar Zahav. And that's where I would say I got my credential to queer religion. Sha'ar Zahav, in those years, among the things I'm most proud of having participated in, included helping to create a prayer book, a queer Jewish prayer book that sits in hospitals and prisons and college, university ministry offices, and mostly in people's personal libraries. And it's a book with 140 community voices adding their petitions and prayers and poetry to a very traditional Jewish prayer book, so that together you have something that reflects back to a queer identified person, their integrated spiritual life, spiritual, sexual, gender identity is reflected back to them in this book of prayer. And so I'm very proud of the Siddur, among other things. And now the Siddur lives in this Catholic ministry. There are 50 copies of that, and every week we have a lunch called Breaking Bread in the Binary. And students come, they can be guaranteed something tasty that's not from the cafeteria, usually hummus, usually from across the corner, Truly Med, and some kind of icebreakers, and then exercise or a reflection that helps them think about spirituality and queering spirituality and claiming new rituals, new customs, new practices that they might try on and explore, new prayers, some of which are from Siddur Sha'ar Zahav, so that's always there. We often start with some kind of blessing or prayer or thanksgiving, and it's reminding me that I actually wanted to start with a land acknowledgement, which is something we always do in classes at USF. I don't know how frequent that is in other places, but yeah, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that we're here present on Ohlone land, and um, it's unceded, and we have to work towards acknowledging and considering reparations. And as a Jew, I feel like that's something I know we know from in seeking reparations. So we have to work for reparations. And I know that this is acknowledgement is infinitesimally small act, but at least it enables us to acknowledge the past and present and emerging leaders in the hope that it will it will shift us towards making justice, a future justice. So, um, so we have Breaking Bread in the Binary, and we have a student retreat that happens every semester where we take people to somewhere where there's no religious iconography and invite them to meditate and walk and um, sing and dance and come out over a campfire, coming out stories over the campfire. Um, and this year we're hoping to have 40 students go away with us. When I came, it was sort of fledgling. And so I'm pleased that there are students that are building this tradition of it being every semester getting off campus. And we invite different people from faith traditions who are part of the campus to come up and participate in the weekend. So those are some of the programming things we do for queering religion. But then I want to tell you briefly about two of my courses. So when I first came, Aaron said, if you put queer in the course catalog title, you'll have a very popular class, because at this Catholic university, queer doesn't appear in the course catalog. Now I'm happy to say there are 4 classes this semester that have queer. One of my friends, colleagues said, I think we should put queering in front of every subject in the university, and there should be one class. So, but back in 2017, that was a first. And what I came to quickly learn was that because my course was in the Jewish Studies program, I could do, we as Jews could do for the Catholics what the Catholics couldn't necessarily do for themselves. And in Judaism, there's something that's known as there's an idiom referred to as a Shabbos Goy. What is a Shabbos Goy? It's someone who's not Jewish, who on the Sabbath does things for the Jew that the Jew is not permitted to do, like make a fire, for instance. So in an in an Orthodox environment, Jews don't make fires on the Sabbath. That's an act of creation. And on Shabbat, we act as if everything is as it is, and we take rest. We imitate the story of God resting on the seventh day. So we don't make fire, we don't create, we don't add. We just are and take time out from. So in Orthodox communities, well, who's going to turn on the lights? Who's going to pull the lights on? You have someone who's not Jewish come in to do that. That's referred to as the one who is the Gentile in the community, hired to do those things on the Sabbath day that the Jews can't do. So I have likened myself in terms of queering religion as the Shabbos Goy. I can do for the Catholics what they can't exactly do for themselves by putting my big rainbow flag in the university ministry office and hi, welcome, and making sure to publicize the miracle that that is queering religion at a Catholic university. It is actually kind of miraculous that I don't have to worry, that I have the kind of academic freedom to be able to say, you know what, the Abrahamic faith traditions are guilty and responsible for the damage we've perpetrated for thousands of years in engendering homophobia and transphobia, in taking the teachings that are largely ambiguous and situated totally in misogyny and making them be about something else, and enabling democracies to create legislation to kill us, basically, to legally kill. So as a serious Jew, I feel like my response as a lesbian Jew, as a professional lesbian Jew, I feel like my job is to name that we have to take responsibility for the damage that we have perpetrated and to offer corrective. And so in my queering religion class, I invite 10 different practitioners, artists, activists. Um, Marty Rawlings Fine is one of my guest teachers. I'm delighted to lift you up as one of my teachers. I bring in 10 to 12 experts from different traditions, and I invite the students to like learn that Lutheranism, Bishop Megan Rohr, um, formerly Bishop Megan Rohr, the rock star of the Lutheran movement, that Robert Robert Newlings Newton, who is from Imani Church, a black church, that there's our communities that are inclusive and embracing, and you don't have to dismiss religion just because religious people and religious teachers have done what they have with our texts and our ideas. And that's something most of my students, just to give you a sense of the demographic of USF, were recently ranked as the #1 diverse university in the country. 24%, I think, of the student body is white. I'm a minority when I teach in my classrooms, and 65% of the community of the students' campus identify as not religious, nuns, not nuns, but nons, non-religious. and and many of my students are one generation away from having had really religious parents or grandparents, but living in an assimilated time and place, they have had the luxury of throwing off religion and seeing it really just as an oppressive construct. So one field note I would say is that when you put a Jewish female lesbian rabbi at the university ministry office, it makes for a different, students can't just sit, like, actually maybe there is something there for them. Maybe it's not the hierarchical, clerical, boys club experience of homophobia and transphobia that they've just assumed is what all religion is. If you put a rainbow flag in the university ministry office, sometimes people are interested in crossing the threshold and finding out a little bit more. And particularly, my experience has been that most of my students haven't met Jews, haven't met Jewish women authority figures in their tradition, and or leave out Jewish, haven't met female religious authority figures, and certainly no one who talks about the gifts and joys of being queer. All right, there's two more stories that I want to tell, and then I'm hoping to open it to your questions that may be of interest to you. My wife, Wendy, she's lovely, she's right here, emanating positivity. She asked me a question on the way over here that I hadn't really given much thought to, but I think is actually fascinating, and that is that historically Jews and Catholics there have been tensions, and we talk about there being a Jewish-Christian dialogue, a Jewish-Catholic dialogue, but historically that's largely focused on anti-Semitism. And so her question was, how are those tensions manifest as you experience them on campus? And the the two stories I want to tell to answer that really focus on, I would say the headline is Jews as Guests. It's a Catholic campus, and the Jews, Jewish programming, we are there to do it, and we are reminded that we are guests. So when I was first being celebrated as the first rabbi in residence on this Catholic campus, they invited me to the Mass of the Holy Spirit. And that's something that happens at the beginning of the semester. And they said, of course, Rabbi Angel, you'll participate. And I was like, well, I never participated in a Mass before. And they said, well, it'll be lovely. You'll sit on the bima in your robe, and we'd like you to do the reading from Isaiah on the 7 gifts. And I'm just curious, by hand raised, does anybody know what that passage is? Just by reference, the passage from Isaiah on the 7 gifts. So she said, this is what you'll read. And I said, I don't know what you're talking about, but I'm happy to look it up. And she said, well, oh no, you know. The passage in the book of Isaiah where the 7 gifts are mentioned, the gifts of wisdom and understanding, the gifts of compassion, the gift of having fear in God. You know, the 7 gifts. I'm like, well, I know the book of Isaiah, and I will return to look at what this passage is. It's, by the way, chapter 11, verses 3 and following. It's a very famous messianic prophecy. It's a passage of Isaiah that Christians use to point to and talk about when Jesus will endow us as human beings with ample measure of these 7 gifts. So she says, you know the part in Isaiah where Jesus says, I'm like, wait a minute, I know the book of Isaiah, but Jesus isn't in the book of Isaiah. So I've often told that story because it reminds me of my first field note I mentioned. We know so little about each other's traditions, and we don't know what we don't know. Like, here's my Catholic colleague assuming that as an ordained rabbi of 27 years, I would for sure know this very central passage to her faith tradition that is used as a proof text throughout the New Testament. And I had no idea what she was talking about. I felt like an imposter of how could I not know the 7 gifts? Then we agreed, well, I looked into it and I figured out what it was, and I realized that what we shared about this text was the not yetness of it, namely that we hadn't yet all been endowed with great measure of these gifts that will enable us to make for a world repaired. What we share about this text is we long for such a time, and it's not yet. And so I said, I'll read it first in Hebrew and then have a student translate it. And then I'll have to contextualize it, how it's, part of the not yetness of what we share. And she goes, wait a minute, we already have a homily. We already have a little sermon. I'm like, well, I could just give the short blessing for new beginnings, the Shehechianu. That sounds good, she said. So I pivoted to that. But there I was in the Mass of the Holy Spirit, and I was sitting next to the Greek Orthodox priest who, like me, is a guest on this campus. And he explained to me later, as a Greek Orthodox person, he usually doesn't sit on the pulpit because there was a big divide between Roman Catholicism and Greek Orthodoxy. And sitting on the bima makes it look as if we're all one community, and actually there was a big split. But because you're being honored and asked to sit on the bima in this unique time as the first rabbi, I'll join you so you won't be alone. I said, that's lovely. He's very tall. I said, that's really lovely. So there we were sitting on the bima, and the president, Father Fitzgerald, he proceeded to read a scriptural passage. And what I later learned was like, there's the first reading and the second reading. And the second reading is a passage usually from a New Testament text, but it can be any passage. There's no like for Jews, every week, for the next many hundreds of years, what the Torah portion will be that you read on that Shabbat. But in this case, there was some choice about what the calendar reading would be. So I'm sitting there all ready and open to hear, and the passage that he picks is from Corinthians, and it reads, "There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor master. There is neither male nor female. There is only one in the body of Christ our Lord." So that's a hard text for me to, it's printed. I heard him and it's printed, and so I go to look at it again, and I go to my Greek Orthodox friend, like, did they pick that because we were going to be here, or like in spite of the fact that we're going to be here? Like, am I supposed to feel friendly towards this text, or I'm uncomfortable with this text is how I feel? Like, I think if there were another editor, a modern editor, they might have also added, there is neither gay nor straight. There is neither trans nor lesbian. There's only one in the body of Christ. I mean, maybe that's hopeful thinking that the editor would have gotten that into the canon. But the idea being that actually this text isn't inclusive to me. There are Jews, there are non-Christians. We're not all to be homogenized in order to coexist. That's not the world to come. Our beautiful differences are what make for the rainbow, and I want to celebrate that. I don't want to like blend it all together. And wow, when it was over, I had chutzpah, and I went up to the president and said, like, I really need to talk to you about that text. And he like walked the other way. And I realized that was sort of the beginning of realizing too that just because I see myself as a religious authority and Jewish people see me as an ordained rabbi, that being a woman and being queer, I'm not going to get a first audience with the Catholic president of the priest of the university. That's not. I am not. There is neither student nor employee or staff member or clergy ordained who are going to be one with the president of the university. So, that's been a learning. And over the summer, a rabbi colleague said, "Hey, I have a banner for you. Reproductive rights are a Jewish value. Why don't you put that in your university ministry office?" And I'm not going to do it. I already have a flag in my university ministry office, and I want to be able to keep flying it high. So whenever I'm introduced, I will say, this is a terrible time in history, and it's never been a better time in history for a lesbian rabbi to teach queering religion and get paid for it at a Catholic university. So I feel like something I didn't know until I started teaching was that in the state of California since 2011, we have had legislation in place that requires public schools throughout the state of California to teach LGBT history, LGBTQ history in civics and history courses. So I'm just curious, by show of hands, how many of you in your high school years, God bless you, how many of you in your high school years encountered material positively having to do with LGBTQ history? One, two. Where are you from? Where did you study? And what was the class? Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. So was your curiosity driven by your own commitment to go in that direction, and you didn't have a teacher who stood in your way? Yeah. Awesome. And what about you, Angelina? Where'd you go? Mhm. Yeah. I just asked this question to 40 undergraduates, and 3 out of 40 said they had something in their classroom. So part of what I want to say is, if you're in a public school, then and you didn't get that experience, it's because it get passed as legislation, but it took some time to trickle down. It's still taking some time to trickle down. Sullivan, I'm interested in finding out if you're going to get exposed to any of this history in high school. But it's a I want to compare that to Catholic teachings about Christian teachings about Jews through the ages, because um, as recently as the 1960s, in 1960s, there was a Vatican gathering called Nostre Aetate, and among the things they said that Pope insisted on was that Catholics must stop teaching that Jews killed Jesus. That's no longer how we're supposed to interpret and read those texts, and that needs to be stopped. And even though that was the main headline, it's still the case that it's taking time to trickle down. And so, what's my point there? That it's awesome if you're in a public school that you're living in a state where you're going to hopefully encounter this material. But if you're living in the state and you're coming up through, say, a Catholic school education or a Jewish Orthodox religious education, you're not going to have this. You're not mandated. There's no one in your school who's forced to teach something positive about LGBTQ history. And so back to the demographics of USF, 65% of the students identify as nones, but about non-religious, and about 20% identify as 25% identify as having come from some kind of faith tradition, and the majority of those are Catholic students. So, also USF represents 49 different countries and 47 states in United States, and yeah, that's just part of the diversity profile, I guess. Mm-hmm.
With what you were just talking about the oh, sorry, hi, regarding what a lot of Christian traditions teach or trying to change about their teachings around uh, Jewish people, tying it back to USF. Do you have any idea of like the demographics in terms of evangelical, because I know that particular denomination or sect within Christianity, it's still seeing growth more globally, but they are very much like their job is to convert everybody who's not like them.
Yeah.
Which creates a hostility for everyone.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, I do have students every semester who come from fundamentalist homes. Just this last summer, I had 3 students out of 30. One was from a Muslim fundamentalist home, one was from an evangelical Christian background, and one was actually from a Jewish messianic background. And but the students themselves, like, they recognize a hypocrisy early on and feel very protective and distant from their faith traditions. So those students are already coming into these classrooms feeling like they've been traumatized and hurt by religion. And like one student said, I kept praying that USF would drop its requirement that you had to graduate with a theology and religious studies class. And then all of a sudden on the banner, I saw a class that would fulfill that core requirement called Queering Religion. And I thought, there must be a God, you know? So I do have a lot of students who really have been really deeply damaged by people in their family, priests, ministers, religious school teachers, all of whom have hated on queer folk. And I love that part of what I get to do at this place is wave a banner that says, like, I see you, and we're here to help address that. We wouldn't need to queer religion if queer people hadn't been mistreated by religion, right? So, yeah.
Oh, thanks. I think what you're doing is awesome. Like, it's very cutting edge, and I really applaud you. And it seems like the basic message of queering religion, that course, is, hey, queer people, you have a place in religion, which is awesome. And my question is about the majority of the students at SF, USF, thank you, USF, who do not identify as religious. Could you talk a little bit about, like, how many of those people take your class? You know, if they don't identify as religious, do you offer anything? Like, hey, religion or even spirituality has something to offer.
Yeah.
And if you want to talk about any, like, people who come to you personally, that would be interesting too, like counseling one-on-one.
Well, first, just hearing your question makes me want to undress a little bit. So I am gonna, like, I don't know if it's your voice or what it is, Karen, but anyway, here I am. I'm taking off my first layer, and I'm boasting my "I'm a bigger lesbian than you" T-shirt. I just want to say something about this T-shirt is that when one day I was on my way to teach class, this is like great outfit for class, and I realized the board of trustees of this private university are meeting and gathering, and there's some kind of protest because they're raising tuition, and so there's this gathered protest, and they're intentionally doing it so the board of trustees have to walk by through this protest, and all I've got on is my "I'm a bigger lesbian than you" T-shirt. And anyway, T-shirts can be a form of activism, definitely. So most of my students are nervous about religion and aren't identifying as practitioners, even if they were 3 months prior to arriving to college. And I think a success in my class is when students come to see that there are all kinds of wonderful things about religions, like community, like being part of a shared group of people who value coming together, whether they like each other all the time or not, but are there to show up for each other for life cycles, for highs, the life highs and the life lows. And um, part of my class deals with learning about marriage. Why would queer people want to get married? And students will say, like, marriage is the last thing I'm interested in. I'm from a failed marriage. Um, Climate change. Have you heard about the more pressing things that we should? Marriage equality is like really low on the list, Rabbi. And but by the time they meet and hear from a few couples who worked hard to be able to queer their customs to make it work as an authentic, gay wedding, that they think maybe I could make this ritual my own and not just throw it away because it's heteronormative and resembles all the things that make us suspect about marriage. Um, oh, they see these two black men bringing in like 8 different religious traditions that they've all dabbled in, and each act is full of meaning, and they're all on board, and the students witness that, and then they have to think, well, yeah, why I might want something like that myself, or to make something like that for myself. Um, that's one of the gifts of, I think, liberal Jewish practice, is that we have full permission to manipulate something, to take what works and leave the rest behind. Um, and I think you asked another piece that was about counseling, but I wanted to mention the second class that I teach, because you all might know some people who would be interested in being part of this course. It's called Honoring Our LGBTQIA plus religious elders. And what it is I pair students in groups of 3 and 4 with someone 60 and older who's queer identified, and they meet for an hour over 12 weeks. They are interviewed, the elders are interviewed in 5 different areas: their coming out stories, their experiences around Stonewall, from Stonewall to HIV, um, what their relationship with their religious identity has been vis-a-vis being queer, how feminism influenced them in their lives, and what they think and how marriage equality has been something that they've thought about or helped to make happen, or couldn't have been less interested in. But to talk about some of these highlights in queer history over the last 60, 70 years from a lived experience. And so the students get history, they get like a queer grandparent or aunt or uncle who takes interest in them. And it's an obligation for Jews to be able to transmit your legacy to another generation. And most of my elders aren't raising children of their own. So to give them a chance to pass down their story, their history, their legacy, the students make a little legacy video, 10 to 12 minutes, capturing some of the highlights in their elder's life. And those are being archived and are part of an exhibit that will be called Mapping Jewish SF. And they're actually, this semester, they're not all Jewish. So I'm looking for elders who have a sense of being from a faith tradition and having made it their own, and who are good storytellers and making those matches. That's the class I'm teaching this semester, and I'm loving it already. I have a really great group of students.
I like what you said about like making the Jewish tradition your own, like through the context of like queering. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk more about like if there are any particular like spiritual practices or like religious texts that you have reinterpreted or like understand like through a queering lens, and like what that means to you, like what those traditions feel like, what those practices feel like, and what makes it like queered to you.
Mm. Well, the first, I have two examples. The first one is our dedication of learning. So um, it's a Jewish tradition that when you sit down to study a text and or have a ritual of conversation that's meant for learning, that you, prior to actually engaging with the text, you take a moment to set an intention that the learning and the energy in, invoked in the act of learning and transforming, that energy should be directed to someone either who's sick and could benefit from positive energy, or to the memory of someone who would they have had this opportunity to learn what we're learning, it would have been for their fulfillment, it would have made them more content in this world. And so yesterday, we're still in the first few sessions of our class, we do something that we've queered our dedication of learning. So students are asked before the class begins to think about who in their families would benefit from this course of honoring LGBTQ history and values and ideas. And then they light a candle, or in this case, since we're in a classroom, they put their tea light on. And we begin by talking about reading a piece that one of my friends, Joss Eldridge, wrote about the power of memory and how when we share memories of loved ones, we resurrect their goodness. And then she talks about Matthew Shepard and gives a little vignette about his life and death. And another elder talks about Gwen Arroyo and her death and her legacy in our community. And then the students each go around and they've given some thought to it beforehand, and they share, um, you know, for my brother, this is just yesterday, for my brother who committed suicide because he knew in our family he couldn't be gay. And actually, she cried and three other people, we all were like very choked up. My grandmother, my mother, my uncle who died of AIDS, we never talked about what that was. And they go around, they dedicate their learning. And then we say some prayers to honor those memories. And that concludes our ritual. For me, that moment, that ritual, it introduces a lot of people to ritual. And what makes it religious? Is it the flame of the candle? Is it the intended, the way we've directed our hearts? Is it the way we are listening to one another? Is it the petition that God help us cherish these memories and use our learning to advance and repair? Anyway, so it's an introduction to a ritual. It's queering that ritual. And what makes it queer? Partly it's the content, I would say, in that case. But another example is our queer social justice Passover ritual. So it's a custom to do a Seder, and there's a book that tells stories that talk about the liberation from the narrowest place to a place of freedom. And we use that structure, but we've changed the symbols and we've changed the stories so that we're talking about what it's meant to be liberated as queer people, and what it's meant to survive AIDS, and what it's meant to bring women and men who were once not at all interested in each other back into relationship during the fires of the pandemic. And so it's always, a Seder is always a teaching mechanism. And in this context, we've queered it and appropriated it and are using it to tell our stories. So instead of a piece of matzah, we have a bundle of faggots. And instead of a 2 candles to bring in the festival, we have a rainbow candelabra. And there's a reading on what each of the colors of the rainbow mean. And then there are many passages having to do with the history of our community. Did that answer your question somewhat?
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. I have a question about the university. Is there a big BDS movement, a boycott Israel movement? And do they use the word anti-Zionist? And does it feel anti-Semitic to you?
It's a great question. I would say that in terms of what we see on college campuses here in San Francisco in particular, like at State, I would say USF has the least amount of interest or antagonism on regarding Israel and Palestine. And I think there are a couple reasons for it. One is that our program lifts up this counter narrative. So the Jews on campus, Jewish Studies and Social Justice, the department and program is known for promoting Palestinian talks. Whenever we have a point of view, there's always another point of view. There are multiple narratives always at the table. I think there's a wonderful mural when you get on the freeway by a Palestinian artist. I'm forgetting his name right now, but we featured him 2 years before the pandemic, bringing him and his story and his art to say this is what we want to be educated. And we also offer a alternative to birthright trips. So USF has a 2-week, very well subsidized, as you know, birthright trips are, called Beyond Bridges. And they spend a week in Israel and a week in Palestine, and they have educators that go along with the students that are Israeli Jewish and Israeli Arab. And we see it as the best trip possible for young people to take. It's only within the 4 years of your university, whereas the birthright has a longer window of opportunity. One thing I have been aware of is that there sometimes where there could be a more robust conversation on Israel and Palestine, some non-Jews will come in quickly to shut it down for fear that it's going to become a divisive conversation. So so that's kind of an interesting angle, that like for the Jews, we could have a conversation that brings multiple narratives, but if someone, say, in the School of Education is wanting to have a pro-Palestinian panel, I've noticed that in that case, it got really quickly shut down. And some professor came to me and said, do you think as the rabbi in residence, you could help create more spaces where we could have more dialogue? So that's actually something for this year that we're thinking about doing. There was another part of your question. You may or may not know, but I have my own journey around. When I first came to San Francisco in 2001, I gave a sermon. It was my second Yom Kippur sermon in being a rabbi in this community, and I came out as a Zionist. And during the course of my sermon, it was like a couple days after 9/11, and I had a different sermon in mind, but I offloaded that and made it. And during the course of my sermon, like about 30 people got up in the Herbst Auditorium and walked out, and subsequently called me to task to learn more and to offer a different set of narratives. And in subsequent years, on my trips to Israel, I would make inroads and relationships in the occupied territories, um, and then come back and preach about that. And it was like I was there for 15 years, so it was a very dynamic and fluid learning. And I would say by the time I left Sha'ar Zahav, I had very different ideas and thoughts about Israel-Palestine than when I first arrived. And I'm delighted and proud to be in a place where Aaron prioritizes and makes a preference on lifting up, creating safe spaces for Jews to criticize and critique Israel. And yeah, I feel like that's what we need to be doing.
I
Yeah.
think we have time for one more question. Everyone, I know. I will ask the final question then, since no one seems to be raising their. I just had you were naming a lot of stats about the university. Do you know how many, like, the population that's like queer identifying or LGBTQ? I feel like
Yes.
it's probably really big, but I don't know if that's just because I surrounded myself with everyone who was queer.
I love ending on that because for the first time ever this last summer, our provost, who's African and and religious and a dyke, and is proud and comfortable talking about those identities, she wrote in a letter to the university that for the first time in print said that somewhere between 25 and 30% of the university are queer identified. That's awesome. And what's awesome is that they know very well that putting that in print is going to rub some people. Like when I first came and there was all kinds of publicity about me, we got a few Catholic conservatives who wrote in and said, well, there goes my alumni money. And like, what a shonda. That's a shame for the Jews and the Catholics. And, this story made it all the way to the Jerusalem Post, actually. And they wrote really hostile, negative things. But yeah, it's quite sizable. And, whenever I am at the microphone, I say, and I'm a professional lesbian rabbi, it's often the case that, like, some adults, meaning professors, staff, administrators, and Jesuits, will come to me and say, thank you for saying that out loud. That really makes more space for me. Even though everybody knows there are tons of queer identified faculty and staff, people aren't naming it, and it's not the content of what they're doing. And so yeah, I want to end with one last little story that I just have to share, which is that every semester my classes, they fulfill an elective in gender and sexuality. So I have certain points I have to make in order to get that credit. In order to give like a lecture on sexuality, I have to cover certain kinds of things. And I always make a point of telling my students, this may embarrass some of you, but I got to tell you, in Judaism, masturbation is okay. And I point them to the text in where the man named On, he spills his seed and he's killed, and it's from this biblical story that onanism is considered reprehensible and morally forbidden to spill your seed. And then I show them that, like, as early as the 5th century, the rabbis are arguing about how that is just terrible teaching, that it may have been the case that On dropped dead, but it certainly wasn't because he was spilling his seed. There's all kinds of commentary where they go back and, well, how much seed can you spill? Is there excessive masturbation? Then that's not okay. But here in the 5th century, we're having these conversations, and I want you to know that not all religion prohibits you from touching yourself. And in fact, in this time of pandemic where it's hard to make connections, think of yourself as having, some exercises as given to you in queering religion for pleasuring yourself and discovering your abilities. And like, students will write to me every semester and say, oh my God, that lecture changed my life. Like, I've never been given permission. I've never been told it was okay. I've always been told it was sick. I've always been told, save that for your husband. The message is, so here I am in 2022 with the privilege, like certain entitlements and privileges of what I know and believe and can hang on my religion as being and it is, so may you go out tonight, and however you go, may you find the joys and delights of being created human with bodies. And there are many ways to multiply. So multiply these ideas and pass them along.